Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the supreme being, most gracious, most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of the Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations, so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Affirmation announcements by the Vice President.
Leave of absence. Honorable Senators, I wish to advise that the President of the Senate, Senator the Honorable Christine Kangulu, is currently out of the country. Honorable Senators, leave of absence has been granted to Senator the Honorable Randall Mitchell, who is out of the country. Honorable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from Her Excellency, the President, Paula May Weeks, ORTT. By Her Excellency, Paula May Weeks, ORTT, President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, to Mr. Ndale Young, whereas Senator the Honorable Christine Kangulu is incapable of performing her duties as the President of the Senate by reason of her absence from Trinidad and Tobago, and the Vice President of the Senate is required to perform the duties of the President of the Senate. As a result, a vacancy has arisen in the Senate. Now, therefore, I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, acting in accordance with the advice of the Prime Minister, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44 of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Ndale Young, to be a member of the Senate temporarily, with effect from the 31st of May 2022, and continuing during the absence from Trinidad and Tobago of Senator the Honorable Christine Kangulu. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President, St. Anne's, this 26th day of May, 2022. To Ms. Yokima Bethelme, whereas Senator the Honorable Randall Mitchell is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of his absence from Trinidad and Tobago, now therefore I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(a) and Section 44(4)(a) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, acting in accordance with the advice of the Prime Minister, do hereby appoint you, Yokima Bethelme, to be a member of the Senate temporarily with effect from the 31st of May 2022 and continuing during the absence of Senator the Honorable Randall Mitchell from Trinidad and Tobago, given under my hand and seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President, St. Anne's, this 26th day of May, 2022. Honorable Senators are required to take the oath.
I, Ndala Young, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do solemnly affirm that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, upon which I am about to enter.
I, Yukima Bethelme, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, upon which I am about to enter.
Papers.
Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I have the honor to lay on the table the following paper as listed on the other paper in my name. The Land Acquisition Requisition Order 2022. Thank you.
Minister of Works and Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following paper as listed on the supplemental order paper in my name. The Motor Vehicle and Road Traffic Amendment to the 4th Schedule Order 2022. I thank you.
Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following paper as listed on the supplemental order paper in the name of the Minister of Finance. The Value Added Tax Amendment to Schedule 2 Order 2022.
Questions on notice, questions for oral answer.
Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Vice President, the government is prepared to answer all of the questions for oral answer on the order paper today, with the exception of question number 95, for which we seek a deferral of 2 weeks.
Honorable Senators, question 95 has been deferred for 2 weeks. Senator Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Question number 93 to the Prime Minister.
Leader.
Mr. Vice President, the government has not launched an inquiry into the performance of VicLab Engineering Consultants Limited on the Port of Spain Hospital Central Block project. It should be noted that it is normal in construction disputes for contractors to ascribe blame to consultants for any problems that arise on a project, and vice versa, especially in situations where a contract has been terminated. But in the absence of a determination of liability by an arbitral tribunal, any such inquiry into VICAB would be premature at this stage. Further, the executing agency, UDICOT, has not indicated any issues with the FIDIC engineer, VICAB, on this project.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Vice President. Can I ask the Honorable Minister whether any formal reports or complaints were submitted to UDICOT by this particular construction company, Shanghai Construction Group Caribbean Limited, on the said allegations against VICAB Engineering Consultants Limited?
Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Vice President, what I am in a position to indicate to the Senator posing the question, the original question, is that UDICOT has not indicated to the government any issues with the FIDIC engineer with VICAB on this particular project.
Yeah, Mr. Vice President, I understand what the Honorable Minister said about issues not being brought to the attention of UDICOT. I'm just asking the Honorable Minister whether he is aware that any formal submission of a complaint was submitted to UDICOT by the said engineering consultancy. That is all I'm asking.
Business.
It's matured into a different question, and what I can assure the Senator is if same is submitted, the relevant checks will be done on correspondence received and issued, and the appropriate answer will be provided to the Senator and to the Senate.
I proceed now, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vice President, can I go on to question? Question number 94 to the Minister of National Security.
Minister of National Security.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Notwithstanding the obvious glee in the tone of my friend, Senator Mark, according to information received from the Chief of Defense Staff, the 28-foot Coast Guard pirogue in question was under maintenance at the time and several factors may have contributed to this development on February the 5th, 2022. The pirogue was serviced on February the 5th, 2022, which entailed cleaning of the bilges and hull to remove marine growth and such barnacles. In order to do so, and to do this thoroughly, the drain plug was removed. The drain plug is located at the stern and below the water line. After cleaning, the plug was replaced, but alas, negligently. On February the 6th, 2022, the vessel began to take on water, and it was determined that the drain plug had become loose, resulting in an intake of water. The vessel eventually became fully submerged. On the same day, however, the vessel was recovered and brought onto land, where the plug was properly replaced and the vessel serviced yet again. The Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard conducted an investigation into the matter and determined that there was gross negligence on the part of some of its personnel. Mr. Vice President.
Senator Mark.
Can I ask, through you, Mr. Vice President, in light of what the Honorable Minister has explained to this Senate, gross negligence on the part of some of the personnel associated with the Coast Guard, can the Minister advise this Honorable Senate what action, if any, was taken against those said officers who he has indicated were responsible for gross negligence?
In accordance with regulations of the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force, and specifically the Coast Guard, the 4 individuals were in fact disciplined. On the 24th of March 2022, 4 ratings, a petty officer, an able seaman, a mechanic, and an ordinary seaman, appeared before their commanding officer in respect of such disciplinary proceedings on charges in respect of the incident. They were found guilty of negligent performance of their duty, and they were subjected, every one of them, to what is known in that world as stoppages or forfeiture of funds due to them in varying amounts. And in addition to that, the first among them was subjected as well to stoppages to the extent of $56,000 and 28 days pay. The other, $28,000 and 14 days pay. Yet another, $28,000 and 14 days detention in the facilities at the Coast Guard without the privilege of going on leave or that kind of thing. And the last of them, $14,000 in stoppages or forfeiture and 14 days detention, Mr. Vice President. Would be returned to the government, I rather suspect the Consolidated Fund, by way of their sanctions for such a finding.
Yes, through you, Mr. Vice President, the Minister, can the Minister share with this Honorable Senate, if he can, the estimated cost to the Coast Guard and by extension the people of Trinidad and Tobago for the repairs that would have had to be conducted with the refloating of the said Coast Guard pirogue? Can the Minister share with us any information as to the estimated cost?
Vice President, is indeed another question which I am not able to answer at this time. Suffice it to say, though, that as I indicated earlier, the vessel was retrieved from underwater, brought back to land, serviced again, and now is in the service of the Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard.
I didn't hear something. Did I hear something?
Question 3, you're allowed.
Okay. Yeah. Mr. Vice President, I would like to ask the Minister whether he can share with the Senate what were the damage or damages that the vessel suffered on that very fateful day when it was sunk or it.
Senator Mark, based on the first answer, I will not allow that question.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I think I'm done through.
Senator Siperson.
And question number 146 to the Minister of Finance.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Mr. Vice President, the National Insurance Act, Chapter 3201, mandates that an actuarial review is conducted at frequent intervals for the purpose of assessing the financial position of the National Insurance Scheme, or NIS. The most recent 10th actuarial review identified inter alia that the root cause of the sustainability challenge faced by the NIS and other social security systems worldwide is the aging population phenomena. This is a situation where people are living longer while having fewer children. The net result is that the number of retirees in the system is increasing while the number of contributors, people of working age, is decreasing, which has created a deficit between benefits and contributions. In fact, all over the world, population aging is having a negative effect on the sustainability of public pension systems. Apart from holding the minimum NIS pension at its current level, at this time, the recommendations laid out in the 10th actuarial review include the following: an increase in the contribution rate from the current 13.5% to 16.2%, and 2, increasing the retirement age from 60 to age 65. It should be noted that the proposal to increase the retirement age is not new and has been recommended by the NIB to government on several occasions as a result of several actuarial reports prepared by the International Labour Organization, or ILO, going back many years. For example, in the 9th actuarial review of the National Insurance System covering the 3-year period up to 30th of June 2013, which was published in June 2015 under another government, it was recommended by the NIB's actuaries that in order to improve the financial viability of the national insurance system, the retirement age for an unreduced pension should be gradually increased from age 60 to age 65 over the period from 2025 to 2060. Recommendation to increase the retirement age also appears in the 8th actuarial review of the National Insurance System, which was published in September 2012 under another government. Madam President, the government is of the view that an increase in the contribution rate should be a last resort. On the other hand, the NIB's actuaries are of the firm view, supported by scientific analysis, that an increase in the retirement age will increase the level of contributions to the national insurance system and reduce costs, and will also provide workers with the opportunity to earn their full salary and be engaged in productive activity for a significantly longer period. Accordingly, the government is engaged in active consultations with key stakeholders on the issue of increasing the retirement age, starting with the trade unions. No decision has been made yet.
Senator Sipasad, do you have any other questions?
I think the Minister has answered the question at this stage. Thank you.
Finance. Senator Sipasad.
President, question 161 to the Attorney General.
Attorney General.
My thanks to Senator Sipasad. The Law Reform Commission has prepared and submitted draft amendments to the Computer Misuse Act, Chapter 11, Number 17, to better address cybercrime offenses and to establish a more robust framework for the enforcement of cybercrime penalties. The draft legislation is currently being reviewed by the Attorney General.
Thank you, Attorney General. Mr. Vice President, through you, what are the major challenges that the government have identified in treating with cybercrime offenses?
Attorney General.
There are a number of challenges which the government has identified in treating with cybercrime offenses, but I think that in a nutshell, the challenges can be regarded as the nature of cybercrime. It is a fast evolving, very dynamic and fluid reality. And therefore, the challenge is to provide in the first instance for a definition of cybercrime which will allow sufficient flexibility in the response and therefore the enforcement which provides for penalties.
Thank you. Attorney General, through you, Mr. Vice President, does the government intend, now I know you said you were reviewing it, but does the government intend to engage local businesses, consultants, etc., and other key stakeholders to update the provisions of the draft cybercrime legislation, which probably needs some adjustment given the dynamic nature of the environment?
Attorney General.
Through you, Mr. Vice President, certainly the government will engage all relevant stakeholders in this burgeoning and dynamic area of our current reality. Yes.
Mr. Vice President, does the Attorney General have a timeline? Because these cybercrime attacks are just coming fast and furious, and the longer we wait, you know, it's going to have real issues. So do you have a timeline, AG?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Vice President. The timeline is captured, I think, by one word, Honorable Senator: expedition.
Thank you, Attorney General.
Government business bills, second reading.
Minister of Rural Development and Local Government.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Municipal Corporations Act, Chapter 2504, the Burial Grounds Act, Chapter 3050, the Cremation Act, Chapter 3051, the Advertisements Regulation Act, Chapter 3053, the Recreation Grounds and Pastures Act, Chapter 4101, the Highways Act, Chapter 4801, the Dogs Act, Chapter 6754, the Property Taxes Act, Chapter 7604, and the Planning and Facilitation of Development Act, Number 10 of 2014, be now read a second time. Mr. Vice President, the exercise of this Senate today is to consider the work brought here before honorable members by the passage of local government reform in the House of Representatives. Mr. Vice President, this has not been a short journey. Trinidad and Tobago effectively has always understood that empowering the people of Trinidad and Tobago in a better system of governing themselves is one of the most sacred things that we can do. It's why we pass laws for the peace, order, and good governance of our society, according to Section 53 of the Constitution. In this exercise, the bill before us is rooted in deep history. Indeed, Mr. Vice President, the bill before us really represents a fundamental amendment to 9 pieces of law in a bill which took our country decades to develop. The bill before us is a 2020 bill. It represents amendment to 9 laws. And in those 9 laws to be amended, the Municipal Corporations Act is to be amended in respect of 81 individual amendments. When we look to the Burial Grounds Act, we have 1 substantial amendment. We look to the Cremation Act, we see, Mr. Vice President, 3 amendments. We look to the Advertising Regulations, 10 amendments. We look, Mr. Vice President, to Recreational Grounds, 1 amendment. The Highways Act, 1 amendment. The Dogs Act, 2 amendments. The Property Tax Act, 4 amendments. And the Planning and Facilitation Development Act, 1 amendment. It means, therefore, that we have approximately 101 amendments, minimum, depending upon how you calculate the amendments, to go through. And I have the task of 45 minutes to pilot 101 amendments, which means I'm flagging up front that the presentation that I give today will be more so a thematic presentation with reference to some of the individual core aspects of the law across the several laws that we seek to amend, rather than with the fair opportunity to go through all. I therefore pledge to listen to the contributions of all honourable senators and at committee stage to entertain perhaps a deeper investigation of where we stand in relation to these. Now, Mr. Vice President, the reason that we're amending the Local Government Act in its entirety, the local government structures in its entirety as we propose today, represents a dare to dream and just start philosophy. This country has been blessed to have had a long history, quite a peaceful one by and large. But it was in 1959 that with the birth of the Exchequer and Audit Act, we really saw local government move away from the ground level of its organization, and we saw the centralization of power as it related to 2 main aspects. Firstly, central government was given control over financial situations, and then developmental aspects were given to central government. So it was the Exchequer and Audit Act, pre-Constitution, 1959, that really wrestled away development away from local government. We have had, following that, the Sinanan Committee in 1965, our post-independence attempt at local government reform, which of course went through the usual platitudes of greater role for on-the-ground structures and let the people govern themselves, principally, which we all aspire to. After that, we saw the County Councils Act 1967, which divided and consolidated executive powers across 7 counties, and Tobago featured as a county, as we saw in our recent reflections on Tobago autonomy. In 1974, we had the Hugh Wooding Commission, and that went through an entire exercise of administrative power, of devolution, but all that was born out of the Hugh Wooding exercise was the division of the St. George West County into St. George East and St. George West in 1980. In 1983, we saw a policy paper on community development and local government. In 1989, we saw the NAR government produce a policy paper, 1989 to 1990, and then move into one of the major aspects of reform in Clause 3 that you see here today is the production of the Municipal Corporations Act, number 21 of 1990. And that Municipal Corporations Act, Mr. Vice President, divided into 16 parts, comprising 273 clauses. Clause 3 of this bill focuses on a large package of amendments comprising some 81 individual aspects, some of which I will go through in some detail in a short while. Mr. Vice President, it was from the 1990 Municipal Corporations Act, which came into law in 1991, that we then moved into the continuation of discussions of how do we get more power into local government hands. And, Mr. Vice President, following upon that, in 2002, there was a policy paper produced. In 2004, and I have them here with me, having read them all, a draft policy paper on local government reform 2004. There was a draft white paper on local government reform 2006, produced by the Ministry of Local Government. There was a Ministry of Local Government draft white paper on local government reform 2009, entitled Embracing All. There was a green paper on local government reform, April 2008, just before that. There's a policy on local government transformation and modernization produced by the People's Partnership Government in the year 2012, October 2012. Following that, there were notes to Cabinet and Cabinet minutes in terms of local government reform, something which my government championed in 2014 and 2015, and born out of that, September 29th, 2016, we had a Cabinet minute considering what this government would do about local government reform. There was a note to Cabinet approved with a full policy paper on local government reform, and that was September 21st, 2016. We then went on to a draft policy, October 2016. We then saw Cabinet Minute number 39 of January 11th, 2018, with an update on local government reform. We then saw in 2019 requests for information by following stakeholder engagement, which I'll come to in a moment, provided by the ministry. We then saw, and I'll come in a little bit more detail to this, the Joint Select Committees on Draft Law in 2019 and in 2020. We saw the production of an interim report of the Joint Select Committee, appointed to consider and report on Miscellaneous Provisions Local Government Reform Bill 2019. We then saw the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government give presentations to the Parliament, December 2020. And then we had the report of the Joint Select Committee to consider and report on the Miscellaneous Provisions Local Government Reform Bill 2020. Now, I've taken the time to traverse 1959 straight through to 2020. The local government bill that comes by way of a package reform before us today represents a culmination of decades of consideration. And the bill before us for analysis was born out of a Joint Select Committee in which several senators sat alongside members of the House of Representatives. And importantly, it represented why we've taken so long, because in the report of the Joint Select Committee, at the very last page, Mr. Vice President, there's something called a minority report, which represents the views of the opposition. Why? Under the Republican Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Section 54 sets out the degree of entrenchment for provisions. You cannot have passage of law that infringes on certain aspects of the Constitution unless the formula is supported by votes of more than certain numbers. In some instances, it's 3/5 of the House. In some instances, it is a simple majority. In other instances, it's a 2/3 majority or a 3/4 majority. And if we are attempting to manage deeply entrenched provisions in the Constitution, a by far greater entrenchment formula is required, arguably at 2/3 support level or 3/4 support level. But in this minority report that I've referred you to, Mr. Vice President, you will note that there was no support coming from the opposition. And I say that to say why I started with dare to dream and just start. Because after the journey of 1959 to 2022, where we stand now, if we cannot achieve the support of getting an opposition to agree to deep support, the minority report here makes important measure, because during the 11th Republican Parliament and 12th Republican Parliament, Dr. Suraj Ratan Rambachan, Mr. Rudranath Indar Singh, Ms. Khadija Amin, all persons with local government experience and effect. And then during the 12th Republican Parliament, again, Ms. Khadija Amin, Ms. Vandana Mohit, and Senator Anil Roberts all participated, but the minority report comes down to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. That there is no support for the local government bill, number one, because the creation of an executive council excludes the voice of the minority. Number two, the opposition disagrees with property tax being implemented at this time. Number three, there are no provisions for equity in population, geographic size, and allocation of resources to each municipality. Number four, the bill reduces the protection of workers by recognized majority unions. And then number five, insufficient consultation with stakeholders. And those are the submissions of the loyal opposition in this parliament. As it comes to the last of the points, the sufficiency of consultation, permit me to put on record, Mr. Vice President, that there has been massive consultation in the many decades of involvement of how this bill has come to light. And Mr. Vice President, if you'd permit me to put on the actual record what those consultations involved, I would say, Mr. Vice President, that the consultation shows, and I'm going to go to the most recent events, the Green Paper on Roles and Responsibilities in 2008, all of which is fed into this bill. One internal consultation, 300 persons attended. The 14 regional corporations were held consultations via ministries. 8,500 persons attended. 250 national, regional, and community-based organizations. In October 2015, again consultations, again before us in the word and content of the bill that we now debate. Over the period 2015 to 2016, in the 14 consultations, we had an audience of interactive platforms, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and actual receipt of submissions. 430,000 and almost 300,000 users on Facebook contributed. 32,000 impressions and 3,500 profile contributions on Twitter. 11,000 visitors, 200,000 hits on the microsite. Draft policy transaction local reform piloted, and permit me to stick a pin for a moment as I pay homage and salute to the work of two distinguished gentlemen in this government. One, the late Senator Franklin Cann, and two, my distinguished and esteemed colleague, Senator Kazim Hussain, who piloted the champion work for the reform before us today, and which I, like a midwife, have come to deliver as minister holding the product of his position, having had my fair share of having drafted the law as Attorney General in my tenure. So the DNA of these two gentlemen are here, equally so with the DNA of one Hazel Manning, who in 2008 and 2009 went on the champion cause of delivering the work product now before us. Now, I've taken the time to go through years of consultation, the number of persons who contributed, because it's contained and relevant to whether this law before us is proportionate, has had the benefit of seeing the square and proper light of day, and whether we can have faith in the work now before us. Mr. Vice President, I can tell you that the bill before us embodies something which I have often preached in the Senate: plant and machinery, people, processes, and the law. And what do I mean by that? If you listen to people speak about local government, there is no real appreciation, as I stand before you now, that the Minister of Rural Development and Local Government has close to 30,000 employees under management. 18 bodies, 14 regional corporations, municipal police, rural development company, CPEP, forestry, and soon the secondary repairs company. In that matrix of 27,000 to 30,000 employees, local government has been reduced to the position where people don't understand the breadth of work that is involved. When we look to the definition amendment section 3A of the bill, clause 3A of the bill, and we look to the mere definition of a local highway authority, highways authorities being the Minister of Works and Transport pursuant to the Highways Act. We look at the definition of that. We look at what orphan roads are. We look at what parks are. People in Trinidad and Tobago are not being told the data that 80% of the road network, as at 2000, lies under the hand of the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government. 80% of the road network in Trinidad. The last vesting of roads in Trinidad and Tobago and parks and places happened under the hand of Carlos John in the year 2000, and we have 22 years of vesting, which will come to the program shortly. As Minister with responsibility for this portfolio, I am in an aggressive exercise of doing what I know best: data capturing, with the intention of going on a full road show to the people of Trinidad and Tobago to say why it is the time is right for us to do what we do. Mr. Vice President, on the 16th of March 2022, in accepting the role as Minister of Rural Development and Local Government, my gazetted responsibilities included a very important item. It is written in the gazetted position under the hand of the President that my obligation is to wind up the affairs of the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government. In other words, then, I am here to put myself out of the job that is currently cast in the laws that we now manage, take that baton, hand it over to the Ministry of Finance as it relates to a certain part, much like the Tobago model, and very importantly, to empower the local government structures in the 14 municipal corporations. And why do we say that? What are some of the snag list concerns that people say all the time? It comes down to that maxim, that formula: plant and machinery, people, processes, and the law. And I can tell you as I stand now that I've looked at the data of approximately 15 years in the ministry, where we as a people spend $2.4 billion every year in rural development and local government, not including the ancillary aspects of that work alongside this law. And if we were to ask the average person in Trinidad and Tobago after 10 years of $2.4 billion, whether we feel that $24 billion has really been brought to the attention of people, a lot of people will not recognize what I call the hidden work. I've spent the last 7 weekends, 6 on the road properly, conducting a survey and cleanup exercise in Trinidad and Tobago. Thousands of truckloads of refuse, thousands and thousands of tires in recycle point, thousands and thousands of bush cuttings, hundreds of derelict vehicles. Mr. Vice President, you would not believe that the people of Trinidad and Tobago at times have pride in their state and condition. But the mission of the ministry was to say the government is at work so that whilst we hold ourselves accountable, it is only fair to hold the rest of the population in accountability with a purpose in mind. And that purpose, Mr. Vice President, in the law before us now, is to be found in a few thematic areas, and there are 9 of them. Number 1, we look to the interpretation section. That's in the large part in clause 3 aspects of the interpretation section of the Municipal Corporations Act. Inside that Municipal Corporations Act as well, we look to the other thematic area, which is the term and tenure of persons in municipal corporations. We're moving from a triennial period to a quadrennial period. If I look to the third thematic area, again inside the Municipal Corporations Act, Clause 3, we're looking at the terms and conditions as they relate to the people who work there. And that is the dichotomy between part-time service on an honorarium basis versus full-time service in full-time employment. The fourth thematic area is the creation of the municipal council versus the executive council. The fifth thematic area is touching and concerning the municipal police. The sixth thematic area is in looking at the standing committees that we propose form cornerstones of municipal corporation articulation. The seventh aspect is in the concept of property tax, where we take the proceeds of property tax and give it on a permanent retention basis in its large part to the local government entities, the municipal corporations, for use by the people, for the people closest to the ground. The eighth thematic area is in the ministerial function and due process conditions, the proportionality, where we safeguard private rights so recognized by sections 4 and 5 of the Constitution, be they private property or the right against self-incrimination. And the ninth area is in looking at the other aspects of the law, the bill before us now, because there are consequential amendments that we make to a number of laws, highways, recreation grounds, Dog Act, Planning and Facilitation Development Act. Now, local government as an entity has become a universe for me. In this ministry, the Rural Development and Local Government, I now have the privilege on behalf of the government and with my colleagues in agriculture, in works and transport, in health, in planning, in housing, of touching and connecting now the services that people require, where we buy our food, how we are allowed building permissions, how we treat with a pandemic as we look to the reality of zoonosis and the transmission of infections from animals to humans, as we saw with the coronavirus recently. And in looking at the coordinated services right now, there are a few things in the plant and machinery side and the people side that matter. Number one, the current data that I have on the exercise that I've engaged in as Minister with Responsibility demonstrates that 45% of the corporation aggregated assets, that is the 14 corporations put together, 45% of the assets are non-functional. Two, in terms of people, that a vast majority of our positions are not currently filled. And this bill treats with Public Services Commission, Statutory Authority Services Commission, and the concept of contracting. Because you have to have people. How do you represent 70 to 80% of your annual $2.4 billion paying for employment if the managers for the persons on the ground are not with security of tenure or filled by people that are in post for the correct position and time? Three, when we treat with the money aspect, we have an expression in Trinidad and Tobago. It's called champagne taste and Morby pocket. How do we decide where to spend? And when we are spending, we are faced with the reality, as I am firmly on the ground, having the time of my life in meeting people in this country, I can say quite honestly, and understanding needs of persons, most people say, I have a small problem. Is this small street light here? This small drain here? But when you aggregate all of the small issues, it's not one street light on one corner, it may be 100,000 in Trinidad. It may be several drains, it may be several secondary road aspects. You see, the line of sight is important, and this bill proposes, when we look to the people aspect, the standing committees, the full-time employment, it proposes that we have accountability and people to manage. So may I ask what time is full-time, Mr. Vice President?
You have exactly 20 minutes remaining. 47 is your timer.
Say a prayer for me, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, if I jump quickly to the bill and I get to the definition section as the first thematic area, I want to point out immediately, you'll see the concept of complex development, of simple development. You will see that we are talking about divisions. You see that we're introducing the concept of an orphan road. That is things which are built but not claimed, where people live and have nobody to carry out services for them because they're not vested in anybody. When you look to the concept of the municipal directors of finance, the CEO, the National Planning Authority, when you look to what we are proposing in the amendments, we are seeing that we're anchoring Municipal Corporations Act amendments, definition section, clause 3, into other areas of law that are going to be vested in local government. Planning and Facilitation Development Act, all simple development. Law passed since 2014 to be operationalized by making sure that plans can be processed on a digital platform basis at the local government area. Mr. Vice President, let's jump to the Constitution and government structures. Let's acknowledge that Section 8 of the Municipal Corporations Act speaks to the corporation being a body corporate. Let's look to the powers of the corporations. Let's look to the fact that the period of turnover of persons at 3 years left us really with very little room for people to function. We are now proposing a harmony with the Tobago House of Assembly by going to 4 years as opposed to 3. We are equally proposing, Mr. Vice President, that the persons with responsibility are secretaries, much like the THA has the familiarity with the concept of a secretary under the THA Act. Mr. Vice President, when we look to remuneration, and we look to the amendments to Section 17 of the Municipal Corporations Act, and we see that we are moving away from an honorarium, which is a part-time colonial reflection of people doing a little small work in running a corporation, and we move now in a new Section 17 proposed by Clause 3, Mr. Vice President, 3E. And we see that the members of council are to be paid out of the corporation fund established under 109, and that effectively there are terms and conditions set by the Minister of Finance in consultation with the CPO. We are looking at full-time, like ministers of government, like secretaries of the THA have in full-time operation. Mr. Vice President, I want to take us to the proposed amendments to the structure of people in the thematic areas identified. We are saying in this law, let us have a municipal council that is effectively much like the parliament assembled. In the new clause 33A, you'll see proposed in clause 3M, where we make a section 33A recommendation. We're saying let's have a municipal council and an executive council. The comparator of the municipal council is exactly like the parliament. All members assembled. When we look to the executive council, which is being proposed in the new section 33C as in Charlie, you'll see that the executive council is intended to function like a cabinet. Now, the problem in local government is that you will hear, whether it is yellow or red in complexion politically, you will hear many a chairman of a corporation say, the CEO don't listen. I cannot get the functions done. The CEO occupies a chief position as an officer in the corporation. The CEO is akin to a permanent secretary, but much like the cherry, the mayor or chairman of the corporation sits on top of a cake and the cherry is to be removed. In other words, then, there was no traction in getting the instructions of the executive council into the body of the corporation, and therefore this law proposes that the Executive Council is in a position where the CEO must carry out the instructions of the Council, exactly like Section 85 of the Constitution does, where a Minister of Government has the ability to manage a ministry and that the Permanent Secretary has a corollary duty to perform those functions. It is in that context that we understand that the CEO therefore has to ensure the municipal police. If you go to Section 48 onward, Section 52 of the Municipal Corporations Act, you see the municipal police, all 1,500 positions of them, 750 plus already filled, 776, all other interviews already in gear. Mr. Vice President, what's the point of having municipal police who can't community police? Because the CEO will not release the municipal police to go and investigate domestic violence, or to look at predial larceny, or to patrol the streets with technology so you know where they are. Well, now this law proposes accountability, because there's an ability to carry out the instruction. Mr. Vice President, a very core feature of this bill is that currently the corporations are not permitted the breadth of employment and discipline. So we know that we must obey constitutionally the service commissions. We know we have the Public Services Commission. We know we have the SASC as another commission. This law allows the municipalities to employ by way of contract their employees. No sidestep of the commissions, lest that would require a 3/4 and 2/3 majority in terms of Section 54 support. None of that. What we say here, let us make the law proportionate by making sure that you have to engage with the registered, with the recognized majority unions, and that you have a grievance facility set out in the 12th schedule to the law that we now propose, so that there is due process, separation of powers, accountability within the simple majority formula. The minority report demonstrates the opposition will not support this law. And therefore, the government had a task, after decades of consultation, to bring forward a law that could start. My job is to operationalize that law as the performing minister with responsibility, having received the baton from my dear brother, Senator Kazim Hussein, who gave his life to local government. What I can say now, if I look to discipline of employees, I look to the amendments to Section 34 of the Act proposed by Clause 3N1, I can see that I am in safe ground on simple majority. We further support the workers by the inclusion of a pension fund, etc. Mr. Vice President, is it at 2:45 I end? 47, thank you. Mr. Vice President, let's look to the divisions of the corporation, the processes. Remember I said plant and machinery, people, processes. Look at the processes set out by Clause 3Q as in Quebec. And look at the proposed inclusion of a new Section 35A of the Act, where we're talking about each corporation shall have divisions established to deal with corporate services, finance, internal audit, sport, youth, recreation, development, public health, spatial planning, monitoring and evaluation, community development, infrastructure, disaster management. Which of these is not important? How do we perform these works if we don't have a system and process system to measure the work? The infrastructure that is being built out in the ministry which I manage right now involves a massive digitization program, exactly as we did in the judiciary under the AGLA hand, exactly as we did in the Ministry of Legal Affairs, where millions of records were digitized and fundamental processes. In legal affairs, when I became the minister then, 15,000 people entered by foot at the Ministry of Legal Affairs every 3 days. Now it's down to 500 people because the rest go online. And therefore, we can do it because there's a process developed to do it. It's a matter of replication of what works right. Mr. Vice President, when we look to the divisions and corporations' responsibilities, we look at the new 35E, we look at water, we look at recycling. The auditing function is critical. The Port of Spain City Corporation right now has $45 million of retained money that it cannot get its hands upon to carry out work for the people of the city of Port of Spain because the internal audit department can't do the job. Why? We now propose that the Auditor General can allow for internal audit function to be done exactly the way the Constitution set up the Auditor General to do the job. San Fernando City Corporations retained monies. Chaguanaces retained monies. Port of Spain retained monies. Why should we have close to $100 million that the people of Trinidad and Tobago can't use? Because an auditor is not available. This law attends to that. So these are real living data points that this law proposes solution for. Mr. Vice President, when we look at the tourism and culture aspect, dare to dream of a city where you have a park, as we propose at Adam Smith Square under my colleague Randall Mitchell, Minister of Tourism, Culture, where a carnival city is resident. Dare to dream of San Fernando on High Street where facades are uniform and we can have foot traffic. Dare to dream of a waterfront development in San Fernando where the people of San Fernando have their fair share of development. And understand that Clause 35G, Clause 35H, Sections 35G, Sections 35H allow for that dream to become a reality. Plant and machinery, people, processes, and law put together. Mr. Vice President, permit me to say, when we look at the functions of corporations, that the functions set out in the proposed amendments to Section 37, so proposed by Clause 3S as in Sierra, demonstrates that we have to have contracts, gratuities, that we have to have efficiency in discharge of functions. It's the amendment to Section 38 of the Act that says in the new 38(1)(e) that the Chief Executive Officer is the Chief Administrative Officer and Chief Accounting Officer of the corporation, and he shall, E, be responsible for, in collaboration with the Executive Council, the day-to-day operation of the corporation. That is the goldmine simplicity of making sure that the CEO carries out the will of the people who are elected in corporations to do the job under due process and accountability. Mr. Vice President, you look to the amendments in the new, in clause Section 38 proposed again by Clause 3U as an umbrella, where the mayor and CEO, in performing the functions, the CEO shall act under the supervision and direction of the mayor of the council. That's your equivalent of Section 85 of the Constitution. All chief officers and employees of a corporation shall take direction and report directly to the chief executive officer of that corporation. You see the hierarchical construction of accountability. Is this law political? Yes, it's highly political. Is it partisan? No, it's not. Last time I checked, whether you are a red corporation or yellow corporation in political complexion and color, everybody wants that. And therefore I ask the question, how can the United National Congress as an opposition stand in the way of that? Mr. Vice President, let's get, as time is short, 7 minutes and counting, to Clause 3Y as in Yankee. We look to the amendments to the occupational disease aspects, the new Section 42A, 43, etc. I want to point out that that is a conjunctive list of conditions where entry onto premises must be done with consent, where warranting procedures in sections later into the Act all apply. Municipal police, in the amendment proposed by Clause 3A as in Alpha, C as in Charlie, in making sure that the municipal police takes into account Police Service Commission and the SASC, Mr. Vice President, the municipal police are required to bring safety to the people that they represent. It is unacceptable that the municipal police are under the hand and direction of a corporation that says, go and watch the corporation assets and go home at 4 o'clock. That's why we proclaim the Evidence Amendment Act to turn on CCTV evidence. It's law. so that a camera can take the evidence and put the municipal police at work on the field, knowing the people of the community, bringing intervention, protecting against domestic violence, protecting against larceny, bringing comfort, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, permit me to jump very quickly to the issues of quorum in the amendments to Section 65. Permit me to point out that the standing committees in the amendments to Section 68 are critical. And I want to focus on the standing committee on audit in particular. This is the amendment proposed to Section 69 of the Act. The audit committee shall comprise 2 members appointed by the mayor, 1 member nominated from the minority members, and where there are no minority members, 1 member appointed by the mayor, and 2 members from civil society, or 1 from civil society, 1 from the central audit unit of the Ministry of Finance appointed by the mayor, and who shall meet the requirements of subsection 7 and play an advisory and monitoring role. You know what this equals to? This equals to the kind of structure that we have in the Public Accounts Committee, in the Public Accounts Enterprises Committee, in the Auditor General structure. We are introducing into audit committees for the first time a degree of independence. And I can tell you on the processing side, the data side of the equation that you are all well accustomed to me in terms of my approach, I can tell you that the data right now, we have an IT expertise inside of the ministry. We are completely reformulating the manner in which processes happen, how engineering happens. Mr. Vice President, it takes 6 months for a file to reach the desk of the minister. So at mid-year, the PSIP performance is 2%, and it should be 50% because they're on a manual paper system. And the time to operationalize that has only become now because this law proposes this. The work done by my colleague, Senator Kazim Hussain, prior to me, was the setup of the table to carry this baton forward so that real-time procurement can happen, so that real-time structures can happen, so that the Electronic Transactions Act can work, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, under property tax, let's deal with that quickly in a couple of minutes left. Why on earth would we not want to have currently the amendments proposed for the reintroduction of property tax? These are laudable, and I tell people, fear not. Forget the fear-mongering. Property tax ensures that we can fix the potholes, that we can deal with drainage, that we can deal with bridges. Property tax is currently set out to include residential tax. I want to remind that the Property Tax Act has in that act the ability of the Minister of Finance to add more than residential tax. And therefore, as the system goes live, people in Trinidad and Tobago, you know what they really want to know? Okay, if I'm going to pay my fair share, can I see value for money at work? I have a track record. The government has a track record. Come down and watch legal affairs. Watch the judiciary. Watch motor vehicle and road traffic. Watch the amount of value for money purchased by the people of Trinidad and Tobago in taking digital approaches. Mr. Vice President, in the 2 minutes that I have left, I would like to say that we are proposing further amendments to other laws. I would like to remind that the Planning and Facilitation Act is part and parcel of this. In the other laws, we're removing the old references to county council and structures, etc. Really, Mr. Vice President, to do justice to hundreds of amendments, our standing orders don't permit in 45 minutes the kind of ventilation required. I wish to assure you that there is a team opposite independents and opposition senators, all assembled, much like the Avengers, who can answer all of the concerns at committee stage. I expect a vibrant debate. I do apologize if I've not had a chance to traverse matters that may be of particular interest to individuals, interest to honorable senators present, but I do intend to take copious notes, answer in that very short 30 or 45 minutes and wrap up, but at committee stage, the concerns of honorable members. Mr. Vice President, I end in the 45 seconds left by saying, dare to dream and just start. Forget the negativity of what life can look like for a time. In this House, under Section 53 of the Constitution, under Section 2 of the Constitution, as we make laws for the peace, order, and good governance of our society, today is a day to focus on what our respective parts can equal in coming up with a better law to serve and empower the people where it matters most, at their homes, at their places of work, at their schools. I give my support on behalf of the government, each and every member of us, to this journey as we operationalize local government reform, and I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, I shall now propose the question for debate. The question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Municipal Corporations Act, Chapter 2504, the Burial Grounds Act, Chapter 3050, the Cremation Act, Chapter 3051, the Advertisements Regulation Act, Chapter 3053, the Recreational Ground and Pastures Act, Chapter 4101, the Highways Act, Chapter 4801, the Dogs Act, Chapter 6754, the Properties Tax Act, Chapter 7601, and the Planning and Facilitation of Development Act, Number 10 of 2014, be now read a second time. Senator Mark.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I'm pleased to rise on behalf of the United National Congress to speak to this matter of local government reform. I want to say from the very outset to the former Attorney General, stop selling dreams and get real. Mr. Vice President, the miscellaneous provisions Local Government Reform Bill 2020 is an attempt by this government to amend some 9 pieces of legislation purportedly designed to promote local democracy in Trinidad and Tobago. But what we observed upon closer analysis is that the bill that is before us is in essence not bringing about greater decentralization or even devolution. What this bill does is to promote centralization. And it would, in those circumstances, not achieve the so-called lofty objectives and even goals that the Minister of Rural Development and Local Government sought to advance during his contribution. It is more about form than substance. The contents of this measure are extremely convoluted, incoherent, contradictory, and extremely confusing. Its outcomes, Mr. Vice President, will be superficial, artificial, and cosmetic. And therefore, the midwifery or the midwife that the AG spoke about and placing himself in that particular position to deliver what he would like, quality goods and services, through the implementation of these measures will not materialize. We don't understand, Mr. Vice President, in a bill with 11 clauses and several amendments to the 9 pieces of legislation that is before us, why is the Minister of Local Government being removed from directing local government activities? Why do they want to excise and make the current Minister of Local Government, Rural Development, not play his role and part in local government reform? We now have a new czar appearing on the landscape. It is the minister, he is rather the Minister of Finance. Wherever you turn in this legislation, he looms large and he is effectively in charge. We reject completely this formula in the legislation. And we want to serve notice. When the PNM leaves office shortly, we will have to revisit, review this piece of legislation in its current form. It will not work. Mr. Vice President, if we are serious about local government reform, if we are considering people-centered, driven development and transformation at the grassroots level, Mr. Vice President, there are 2 key elements that haunt local government for decades. And the government has not addressed those elements. And if they made any effort, Mr. Vice President, it is purely cosmetic and superficial. Mr. Vice President, financing is very critical to local government. There's need for a formula for financing local government. And Mr. Vice President, another element that is critically needed to promote effective and efficacious local governance in our country, Mr. Vice President, is the provision of adequate human and capital resources. We need human and capital resources. And when we look at what is before us today, Mr. Vice President, we are seeing the same old. There is no change or meaningful changes to the legislation that will promote genuine local government reform. But let's look at what the government is attempting in this bill. They talk about the Tobago House of Assembly and looking at the formula of executive councils, secretaries, and divisions. But let's see, Mr. Vice President, what are the elements that they have introduced in this new piece of legislation before us today. There is the element of the executive councils, and as the Honorable Minister of Rural and Local Government said, it is like a mini cabinet. There is a municipal council. They are introducing, or the bill is introducing, full-time councillors, full-time mayors, full-time chairmen, full-time aldermen. The Minister of Finance looms large and is in charge. Divisions are being created and they are being supervised by secretaries. Are these secretaries going to have the power to hire and fire? What we have seen in the legislation is that the Minister of Finance will be given the responsibility to determine the councillors, aldermen, mayors, chairmen, terms and conditions of employment or engagement. Obviously, in consultation with the CPO. And then, of course, we have property taxes to be collected, purportedly collected by the corporation to finance operations. And last but not least, the bill administers the final funeral rites on the Ministry of Local Government. So we are burying local government in this piece of legislation, Mr. Vice President. So the new Minister of Local Government will be the Minister of Finance. Mr. Vice President, we reject that completely and comprehensively. There is no role for the Minister of Finance than to provide monies to local government. The minister has no business in local government or finance. But here we see it, Mr. Vice President, as one of the new features in the legislation that is before this Honorable House. Mr. Vice President, how are we going to promote a true grassroots democracy where citizens have an opportunity to determine within just laws the conditions under which they will live and grow and prosper as communities? How are we going to promote a local government system that adheres to the philosophy that is going to ensure that we unite communities around common ideals and to gather their energies and creativity to foster self-sustaining programs? Mr. Vice President, there must be a philosophy behind local government. And I want to tell the government, laws alone will not bring about the transformation of local governance. Laws alone will not do it. There are very many other factors that we must take into account when we are talking about genuine local government reform in our nation. Mr. Vice President, I dare say when we talk about the philosophy of local government, we should be focusing on self-sustaining communities through people participation in decision making. This participation is absolutely necessary, Mr. Vice President, where people need to get more involved in governance. Where in the legislation before us are there provision for people's involvement in the decision-making processes, Mr. Vice President. We are seeing the minister in a particular provision, which I'll bring to your attention during my contribution, where he claims in the public interest, the Minister of Finance can effect the 12th schedule, all the functions of local government contained in the 12th schedule of the legislation before this Parliament. The minister in this piece of legislation, in the public interest, in quotation, can take charge of those functions. Mr. Vice President, this cannot be real, cannot be fair. And I take this opportunity to ask the Attorney General, what will happen to our employees in local government? We are told by the minister who piloted this bill that the workers are going to be on contract. And as if that is something so powerful and so attractive. We have something called the Statutory Authority Services Commission that is responsible for appointing monthly paid workers in local government corporations. What will become of those monthly rated workers under this piece of legislation? Are we going to VSEP them? Are we going to retrench them? Are we going to terminate their services? The minister is silent. He says nothing about what will happen to these workers. What he did say, Mr. Vice President, is that workers are going to be on contract. As if that is something fabulous, fantastic. We do not support contract workers. We do not support contract labor. We do not support the undermining of the SASC. The SASC must be responsible for appointing the monthly rated workers in the corporations, and they must not be on contract. Mr. Vice President, this piece of legislation is not only offensive, insulting, obnoxious, but it must be rejected. We cannot accept the legislation in its current form. We need to go back to the drawing table, go back to the drawing board on this piece of legislation, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, in this piece of legislation, I ask the Honorable Minister, through you, if we are serious about local government, why not have a provision like the Tobago House of Assembly and have local government enshrined in our Constitution? Mr. Vice President, if you go to our Constitution, there's a particular section of it that talks about the Tobago House of Assembly. I am suggesting to the government, the same way how we have the THA entrenched in, when I say entrenched, Mr. Vice President, I'm wrong. It is not entrenched. It is there, but it can be removed because it is there by a simple majority. And just as how it is there by a simple majority, we can also put local government by a simple majority in our Constitution as well. That is an area I would like to put for the government's consideration. Mr. Vice President, I want to indicate another important area of concern. The minister talks about Tobago and the Executive Council and the secretaries and the divisions. He talks about these new councillors being elected under this legislation when it is passed and becomes law. They are going to be full-time. But he doesn't tell us, Mr. Vice President, what is the package of these local government practitioners. They are to be full-time, we are told. But we don't know if they are going to be getting the same pay as their counterparts in the Executive Council in the Tobago House of Assembly. They get $24,000 a month. These secretaries in the THA, would our local government councillors, aldermen, mayors, and others be receiving $24,000? We don't know. So we are in the dark on these matters. We are just speculating because there's no provision for our consideration, even though subject to negotiations. Mr. Vice President, I want to completely reject the Minister of Finance determining in consultation with the CPO terms and conditions for councillors, for aldermen, for mayors, for chairmen. That is a function and responsibility that should be left to an independent salaries review commission. Why is the politician, why is the Minister of Finance, why is the government seeking to politicize local government? Why is the government seeking to have a minister determine in consultation with the CPO terms and conditions of employment for these workers, these councillors? Mr. Vice President, we do not support that arrangement whatsoever. And Mr. Vice President, let me just invite you to look at some specific provisions in the bill that is before us. Mr. Vice President, if you go to 33A of the legislation before us, we will see in fact, let me just take you back to 17.1 on page 9 of the bill that I have before me. It talks about the mayor, aldermen, and councillors being eligible for remuneration as may be determined by the minister with responsibility for finance in consultation with the chief personnel officer. And it goes on to talk about a fund will be established in the corporation to deal with funds that will come from the government, that will come from the so-called property tax, which we do not support, and donations, etc. We have made it very clear that we do not support that arrangement involving the minister. Mr. Vice President, you go to 33A on page 11 of my document. I don't know what page it will be on yours, but it deals with the whole issue of the municipal council of the corporation. And in 33B, it outlines rather the functions of the municipal council. And it goes on to talk about others. Example C, they exercise oversight over the activities of the corporation and its executive council. So the municipal council, made up of all the elected officials and those who are aldermen, will in fact be part of the municipal council. And you see where one of the things that it does is approve the budget of the corporation, and that has to be approved by the Minister of Finance. Mr. Vice President. Then we go on, Mr. Vice President, to another layer in the legislation, 33C, which is the Executive Council. The Executive Council, again, has a lot of important functions and responsibilities as outlined in Section 33C, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. But, Mr. Vice President, when I see, it says, among other things, that the Executive Council will be able to do a number of things. But there's one function that had me a bit concerned here. They have the right to determine strategies for implementation. They have the power to allocate financial resources to divisions. They have the responsibility to deal with the effective day-to-day management of the corporation. They also approve plans. And, Mr. Vice President, the Executive Council has the power to also implement measures without the approval of the municipal council. There is somewhere in this legislation, it is there, but I'll find it for you and quote that section for you. Now, the council, Mr. Vice President, in 33D, talks about the mayor, the deputy mayor, and such councillors that would be part of it. But it goes on to say that the Executive Council shall be made up of not less than 5 and not more than 8 members. I would like to ask, Mr. Vice President, if you have a corporation or council of 14 members elected, made up of councillors and aldermen, and you have 8 persons being on the Executive Council, I would like the minister to explain to this Senate what will happen to the other 6 members of council. Would these other 6 members of council have full-time executive offices? Would they be entitled to full-time salaries? Those things are silent in the legislation as we speak, Mr. Vice President. So we need clarification from the government. We are also seeing in this same section 33D, in the exercise, it said subject to subsection 3, decisions of the Executive Council of a corporation may be implemented without the prior approval of the municipal council. So, Mr. Vice President, the question that has to be asked is, can the council, the Executive Council, implement measures without the approval of the municipal council? Isn't that a recipe for confusion? Who is in charge? The Executive Council or the municipal council? This is confusing. Mr. Vice President, we need clarification on these matters. And then we come to the whole issue, Mr. Vice President, of the organizational structure in 33H rather, where again, if you have an organizational structure, you have to get it approved, first of all, by who? The Minister of Finance. Mr. Vice President, so what kind of autonomy are these councils going to have if the Minister of Finance has to approve everything? Mr. Vice President, you know what this is telling me? This piece of legislation is telling me that in the 14 regional municipal corporations, even though the PNM would have lost 10, or let's say they have 7, and we have 7 as we have today, and the Minister of Finance is in charge, and you have these provisions in the legislation as law. Mr. Vice President, you know what it means? It means that the Minister of Finance can direct UNC corporations under this piece of legislation. He is going to decide, Mr. Vice President, and he is going to approve the organizational structure for the organization. So if he doesn't approve it, you cannot employ certain offices that you may have in your organizational structure. So the Minister of Finance is effectively in charge of the local government operations. So you have councillors who are elected, but their election and their burgesses and the people who elected them, they have no say over them. The Minister of Finance is the boss. This has to be madness, and we cannot support this. Mr. Vice President, I want to advise you, when you go on to a section of the legislation, and I invite you to join me in looking at what is called Section 37, or Clause 37, on page 31, 32, and 33. Mr. Vice President, is the mayor an executive authority? Is the mayor the accounting officer? Mr. Vice President, there is confusion between the roles of the mayor and the chief executive officer. Hear what we are told in 37 U, subsection 2. I quote, "In performing the functions above, the chief executive officer shall act under the supervision, Mr. Vice President, and direction of the mayor of the council." The mayor will be supervising an independently organized and appointed office holder. You know who appoints the CEO, Mr. Vice President? The Statutory Authority Services Commission. What this legislation is saying is that this particular individual who is appointed and could be disappointed by the SASC, because under Section 5 of the Statutory Authority Services Commission Act, they appoint, they transfer, they promote, they remove, and they discipline. That is the function of the SASC. But here you are telling us that the executive officer, chief executive officer, shall, it's a may, you know. Mr. Vice President, it's not may. You must comply and you must carry out the direction given to you by the mayor. The mayor is a politician, and the mayor is directing an independent office holder who is supposed to be insulated from political influence and interference, as it is stated under the Statutory Authorities Services Commission. So we are creating a lot of confusion here. And Mr. Vice President, you go to subsection 3, it says, all chief officers and employees of a corporation, not may, shall take direction and report directly to the chief executive officer of that corporation. Mr. Vice President, what does that mean? It means that the chief executive officer is under the political control of the mayor. And the chief executive officer is now given instructions, and they have to carry it out to all chief officers, all officers, and all employees. So this is now, Mr. Vice President, all these corporations, Mr. Vice President, are now going to be transformed into political vehicles of the ruling party. That is what this bill is about. with the Minister of Finance having total, comprehensive, and complete overarching control and supervision over the operations of these 14 municipal corporations known as councils. And that is what you want us to accept, Mr. Vice President? We have to reject this. We cannot support this bill in its current form. So the government has to come better. I saw in the JSC report a submission made, and I invite my colleagues to go to the submission made by the Statutory Authority Services Commission. It is scathing in terms of what they said to the JSC. They were saying to the JSC, you are trying to make us redundant. You are trying to undermine our constitutional powers. That is what they said in their report. And what we are seeing here, Mr. Vice President, could you imagine the councillor who is now secretary and in charge of his division, which he has total control over and he has total general direction of? Does that mean, Mr. President, Vice President, that this officer will now have the power to hire people? Because the Attorney General talk about contract. We are going into a contract mode. So would these secretaries be able to have the power, Mr. Vice President, to hire people? And therefore it will become a huge party group. The corporations will become P&M party groups. And therefore we cannot support the bill in its current form. Mr. Vice President, I am looking at this thing in trepidation. I can't believe that a government in 2022 will bring such a piece of legislation to Parliament to undermine existing institutions and boasting that they are going to have contract labor in the corporations now. And this is something
Senator
that...
Mark, you have 5 more minutes.
Yes, Mr. Vice President. And this is something we have to live with. Contract labor is a form of slavery. How can we support contract labor? We want permanent jobs. We want security of tenure. We don't want people to be fired every 2 months or every 3 years. We want people to be there for the next 30 years if they want to make a career in a corporation. What they are doing in this piece of legislation is telling you, Mr. Vice President, that when I say come it, you come. And when I say go it, you go. That cannot be proper. That is what this government is about. Mr. Vice President, I want to tell you something in closing. Mr. Vice President, you know, we were told, well, before I close, 2 small points. Mr. Vice President, go to Schedule 13 of the legislation. You know, the government has hijacked the disciplinary powers of the SASC by introducing their own disciplinary code and regulations. Contrary to law, these workers who are working in the corporation are appointed by the SASC, and in other instances, they are subject to a collective agreement between the NUJFW, Amalgamated Workers Union, and the Contractors Workers Union. So they have their own grievance procedure. What is this code inside here? What is this grievance code doing inside here? What is this disciplinary code doing inside here? You are seeking to undermine the SASC. That is why it's here. Mr. Vice President, let me just deal with one final matter before I wrap up. Mr. Vice President, the property tax. You know, we got the impression from the government, boasting they're introducing property tax. We do not support that whatsoever. But what we saw in this piece of legislation, Mr. Vice President, is that the minister, Mr. Vice President, has the power under this legislation, Mr. Vice President, go to page 82, section 10, called the Property Taxes Act. And let me quickly read for you. When I tell you this is a sham that we are dealing with, and it's cosmetic, and they are engaged in tomfoolery, and they are mamagaing the people. Mr. Vice President, listen to this. You will believe a corporation under the law will be able to collect residential property tax and use it for its development. Hear what this is saying. Notwithstanding subsection 1, tax on residential land shall be paid to the municipal corporation in which the residential land is located. It goes on, Mr. Vice President. Notwithstanding subsection 1, the minister may by order declare which of the agricultural, industrial, or commercial taxes may be collected by the municipal corporation and, Mr. Vice President, what percentage of those taxes collected may be retained by the municipal corporation. So, Mr. Vice President, they are telling the country that the corporation will be able to use residential taxes for developmental purpose. And here in section 10, subsection 2 and 3, the minister is telling you, when you collect, I will tell you how much you can spend. Mr. Vice President, this bill in its current form is unworkable. This bill in its current form is reprehensible. It's a retrogressive step. It's a retrograde step, I should say. And we cannot associate ourselves in 2022 with such backward legislation that is purportedly advanced as progressive and revolutionary. Therefore, Mr. Vice President, we reject this bill completely. Thank you very much.
Senator Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Good afternoon, colleagues, for the opportunity to make a contribution to this an act to amend the Municipal Corporations Act, Chapter 2504, the Burial Grounds Act, Chapter 3050, the Cremation Act, Chapter 3051, the Advertisement Regulation Act, Chapter 3053, the Recreation Grounds and Pastures Act, Chapter 4101, the Highways Act, Chapter 4801, the Dogs Act, Chapter 6754, the Property Taxes Act, Chapter 7604, and the Planning and Facilitation and Development Act, Number 10 of 2014. Senator Mark, is always going to be a difficult act to follow, but I'll try my best. We have to ask ourselves today, and this is how I'll start, because I have quite a number of comments about the bill itself, so there's not going to be a long run-up today. As the Minister of Rural Development and Local Government indicated, the act, the report before us, seeks to amend 81 clauses in the municipal corporations, 1 in burial ground, 3 in cremation, 4 in advertisements, 1 in recreation, 1 in highways, 2 in the Dogs Act, 2 in the Property Tax Act, and 1 in the Planning and Facilitation Act, which is quite extensive when you think of local government and what local government means to the people of Trinidad and Tobago and the Burgesses, because it has often been said, and rightly so, that local government is the machinery on the ground that executes the policy of the executive, because the local government councillors and aldermen are the ones who are closer to the people and interface more with the people, by and large, particularly in situations where things go awry. So we've gone over the years, and I'm not going to traverse the history from county councils all the way to the Municipal Corporations Act. And we have to ask ourselves, which is, I think, the genesis of this and many other attempts at local government reform over the last 20, 30 years. Is local government, in its present configuration, adequately fulfilling and supporting the Burgesses' needs in any of the 14 municipalities? Has it evolved to meet the needs of the people in terms of services in the areas of roads, as the Minister of Rural Development and Local Government said, 80%, parks, burial grounds, crematoriums, recreation grounds, sporting facilities, taxes, and we're going to get to the Property Tax Act, and in what is described as minor planning and development initiatives. One of the profound areas that has come up over and over, and I think as of tomorrow we enter the hurricane season, is the issue of flooding in many municipalities in Trinidad and Tobago. And one of the reasons that has been given, and accurately so, over the last 15 to 20 years, when we see the evolution of flooding, which is precipitated in large part by the climate change and weather patterns changing, so we're seeing more drastic flooding happening over and over. But one of the reasons that has been proposed is unplanned development, unauthorized development, and whether or not the regional corporations have the structure and or resources and manpower to inspect, authorize, and deauthorize unauthorized planning, particularly along the hill ranges in the north and central Trinidad, which in many cases watercourses are blocked, natural watercourses along the hills are interrupted, and we have tremendous flooding. And one of the reasons that it happens is because the municipal corporations simply do not and have not had the resources and structures to deal with that. And that is becoming more and more profound as the years pass by. So part of the reason that this type of reform has been bandied about for decades is specifically because of many of those inadequacies. One of the issues that Senator Mark brought up, and I have it on my notes to talk about, is, and I didn't hear the Honourable Minister of Rural Development and Local Government talk about it, is should this report find favour with this Honourable House? What is the transition plan for the present staff, the executive, in that transition? Because the way the report is configured, there's going to be a whole new system and structure involved, and the election and appointment of those officers are going to take place in a completely different manner. So we have no idea about what is going to happen to those persons presently in those situations, if they're going to be eligible for reapplication, and what is the transition plan to this, should it find favour and move towards some sort of transitioned execution in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm also going to deal in part with two aspects of the minority report supplied by the opposition in terms of, one, the property tax situation, where, in my opinion, property tax is an inevitability. Happens all over the world. The question in Trinidad and Tobago over the last couple of years is the time right? Has it been right 5 years ago? Is it right after a pandemic when people have lost jobs? When is going to be the right time? And are there areas of compromise that we can put mechanisms in place for to deal with that? Because at the end of the day, it is not going to be able to be in abeyance forever. So we need to look at not having a one-size-fits-all approach to situations like property tax, or quite frankly, for situations of one of the issues in the minority report, and I think it was discussed in the other place, where some municipalities are more densely populated than others, way more so. And if that is going to lead to an inequity or a disadvantage to those in particularly the rural areas. And I take note of the title of the Honourable Minister who piloted the bill, the Minister of Rural Development and Local Government. And does this report and bill facilitate in a really profound, sustainable way rural development in Trinidad and Tobago that has suffered not only from gaps and shortcomings in local government administration, but from many other aspects of development in Trinidad and Tobago. And I think that also needs to be clearly dealt with. And I have a suggestion and recommendation I hope can work in terms of dealing with this particular report before us. I'm going to go directly, Mr. Vice President, through you to the bill itself. And I made quite extensive notes, starting with page 258 and the clause 3, which looks at clause 3 in Roman 3, which looks at the Municipal Corporations Act is amended A in section 2, Roman 3, C, where it says it raises significant, and it will be applicable where it raises significant architectural or urban design issues, giving rise to substantial regional or national controversy. And I made very specific notes about some words that were used, which I think can be quite subjective or quite, in some cases, inappropriate. And who determines what's a controversy? And when you use words like that, nomenclature like that, it leaves room for multiple interpretations and subjective interpretation. So I think that can and should be replaced with impact or import, where that is concerned. I want to go to now, and it was mentioned by Senator Mark and also the Minister of Rural Development and Local Government, the lacuna that has occurred in local government for many years and in many municipalities in Trinidad and Tobago, where, and it came up because I had the honor to sit on the JSC with many others, and including my colleague on the bench, Senator Timol. And it came up in many of our discussions where there is a situation in many corporations, and from time to time, where if the mayor and the CEO, for whatever reason, happen not to get along, all works can be stymied. And there seems to be no way out of that, because the CEO can tell the mayor, well, I don't take instructions from you. And you're going to be here for 4 or 5 years, and I'll be still here. So a lot of the decisions of the council were stymied in terms of the execution on the ground by the executive staff, because there was no official direction or mechanism to say, well, this person reports to X or Y. So that was one of the main points of contention. And I think this report tries to manage that in a particular way and to deal with that situation, because many of the reports you hear in the corporations in the last couple of years cited that as a major point of contention in terms of how the corporation was run, if it was effective in fulfilling its mandate to the burgesses, because actually on the ground, the people who are in need of services don't really care about what happens. They just want the services, either the services are delivered or not. And I think that part of the bill seeks to deal with that particular paradigm. Moving on, in terms of 33B, I documented by page 263, where we see in Part D, Section 12, in subsection 1, by deleting the word "save for the requirements of the councillor be residents or owners of property within a municipality," and there's a cross out there. And I think that there needs to be a time frame inserted there, because the intention, as I read it, is for the councillor to be a part of the community. And if there's no time frame, for example, specifying for at least a year before, someone can buy property or move into an area and it's unlikely that they will win, because generally with local government elections, the relationship of the council and the person running for the office is one that generally informs. If you've been working in the area for a long time, you have a higher chance of being elected to serve in the position. But to me, that particular area needs some sort of time frame to be specific. Moving to 33B. We see that one of the words that should be changed is there's a discrepancy in whether or not the word alignment or in accordance with, because in alignment with has a different connotation to in accordance with the Planning and Development Facilitation Act. Also in 33B, so in B, my suggestion is it be changed to in alignment with national policies. And also, I'm suggesting we insert a new H, or an H. And this is one of the discussions that came up in the deliberations very often in the GSC, was the fact that part of the mandate in several sections of this report indicate to develop economic opportunities within the municipality. And there's no reference, there's reference to several other collaborations, but there's no reference to the council working with the business chambers or communities in the municipality. And I think that can end up being a missed opportunity, because it can't be that there are business chambers working in municipalities, championing opportunities, economic opportunities for the burgesses in the area, and there's no requirement for collaboration with these chambers in the law itself. And I think that needs to be addressed, and it can simply be addressed by inserting the phrase in an H, collaborate with business chambers where possible to identify opportunities of mutual benefit in the interest of the burgesses of that municipality. So I think those types of alterations need to be addressed. The suggestion I was making before with 33B is 33 big B, capital B into small b, formulating broad strategies for implementation by the Executive Council in the corporation in accordance, which is what states there, and I would change that to in alignment with national policies. Moving along, Mr. Vice President, in terms of 33E, which is on page 172, or sorry, 33.1, where it says, and it starts, every municipal corporation shall have and exercise the powers assigned to a local authority under the Public Health Ordinance, and in Part 3, where the owner or occupier of premises permits entry of an officer of the municipal corporation onto premises, the officer shall only remove anything from the premises with the approval of the owner or occupier. And I think the word approved occupier needs to be inserted there, because in some instances you may have an occupier who is illegitimate in that regard, and an illegitimate occupier, for whatever reason, should not be able to authorize an officer to remove anything from the premises. It may seem like an understood or an implied phenomenon, but I think it needs to be clearly stated that it has to be an authorized occupier. Moving to section 34(2), where subject to section 34A, a corporation may, and A is employ such persons as it considers necessary for the due performance of its functions. B, set the qualifications for the posts of the corporation, and C, discipline or dismiss its employees. I think it should be inserted here because it's referenced later on in Schedule 12 in accordance with the provisions of Section 12, which dispute and grievance procedures and disciplinary codes, because it can be read there that someone may just decide to discipline and employ. And yes, the grievance and discipline in Section 12 should cover the whole bill. But if it's clearly stated, there's no misunderstanding or ambiguity in that particular situation. Moving to 34A, A corporation shall provide for the establishment and maintenance of a pension scheme or arrange membership in a scheme for its contracted, permanent, or daily rated employees. Moving on to Part D. Give donations or subscriptions to charitable institutions, benevolent funds, and other objects calculated to benefit its employees. And I think that is way too wide. Give donations or subscriptions to charitable institutions. Who determines what is a charitable institution in this case? And that opens the door, if you are to be as cynical as I am sometimes, to malfeasance. And we took quite a bit of time to pass an NPO Act in Trinidad and Tobago. And I think it should be inserted there. Charitable institutions registered under the NPO Act of 2019. So there's some sort of requirement for some sort of standard to be met before the corporation can donate, if it so sees fit, as opposed to leaving it open to any charitable institution, which, I mean, that could be anything. And it could end up being some entity that's not bona fide and not run in accordance with best practices. And so monies are moving from the corporation to these unregistered and unregulated entities. And I think that needs to be dealt with, specifically saying a charitable organization or institution registered, or an NPO registered under the NPO Act 2019. So there's some sort of regulation and supervision where that is concerned. Moving on to 35A, each corporation shall establish divisions with the following responsibilities: corporate services, finance planning, etc. And in Part D, sport and youth development, and, Part A1, I think there should be the insertion of business development entities and chambers included in the responsibilities. Because I think one of the mandates of the corporation should be, and it's stated later on in the report, to identify economic opportunities for each of these corporations. And if it's not doing that, and specifically too, with regards to micro and small enterprise development, I think we're missing an opportunity where that is concerned, for it to be a mandate of the corporation to seek out those kinds of collaborations and facilitate those types of opportunities for burgesses who may benefit from that and from whom the entire municipality can benefit in terms of job creation and sustainability in that municipality. So I think just like part of the responsibility includes finance planning, sport and youth development, recreation grounds and public spaces, public health sanitation, spatial planning and inspectorate monitoring and evaluation, I think part of it should actually be in Part I, community and business development and social services, etc., to keep reinforcing that part of the mandate is to look out for those and identify those economic opportunities in the interest of the burgesses and facilitate their growth and development. Moving on, Mr. Vice President, page 276, Part 35B, which speaks to small e, which speaks to the division of the corporation with responsibility for corporate services shall be responsible for, and it goes down from performing human resource planning, HR planning, administrative, clerical, secretarial, conducting registry and records management, legal advice. It goes down to Part E, which says developing and implementing information technology business solutions for networking, digital connectivity, and e-government enabling capabilities. And I think, as is present in other areas of the report, it should state in collaboration with the Ministry of Digitization, so that there's some sort of harmonization between what the Ministry of Digitization is doing on a national scale and what the municipal corporations is doing, or are doing, on those localized scales. Because you don't want a situation to develop where on the national scale there's a Ministry of Digitization looking at policy and implementation protocols and sustainability protocols in the IT world, and it is not in alignment with what the general national policies are as mandated by the Ministry of Digitization and Digital Services of the country. So I think that is also something that should be considered. 35C, which is the division of the corporation with responsibility for finance, planning, and allocation of resources shall be responsible for. And in part F, and I did say I went into a lot of detail in this report, timely and accurate reporting on all matters of a financial nature. One of the really disturbing issues that has arisen in terms of the running of regional corporations in Trinidad and Tobago, I think it can also be applied in some regard to past iterations of the Tobago House of Assembly, is the issue of timely financial audited statements. In some instances in this country, and I know my colleague, our colleague Senator Sipasai will go into more details about this, is the issue of some corporations having not had audited financial statements for as many as 10, 15 years. And if this report and law seeks to give more power and devolution of power at that, and the ability of these municipal corporations to collect taxes and use these taxes for developmental purposes and maintenance purposes in the municipalities, there needs to be some sort of provision in the law where they are held to a higher account where audited financial statements are concerned. We can't be giving corporations more power to collect money or power to collect money and to be more autonomous, and we don't also provide mechanisms for more stringent regulation and more oversight where taxpayers' dollars are concerned. I think that will be a terrible dereliction of duty, because all it will mean is that entities are collecting money and not required to be accountable to the people of Trinidad and Tobago or to the state in any way. And I think not having that requirement for timely to be specified not more than 3 years after the assessment period is due, for example, I'm just using a time frame to throw out there, is going to be a complete dereliction of duty on our part and a real opportunity for malfeasance in the future where you can have runaway corporations collecting money and not providing timely audited financial statements and accountable in that way. And I think that needs to be addressed very, very profoundly and succinctly. Moving to also 35D, the division of the corporation with responsibility for recreation grounds, sporting and exercise facilities and other public spaces. And I would insert in A, B, C, and D. In every one of these subclauses, for example, in A, there's developing, maintaining, and managing recreation grounds, sporting and exercise facilities, and other public spaces. I think we need to put recreation and cultural grounds and insert the term cultural in there, because a recreation ground may be perceived as something different to a cultural ground. And because in the context of regional corporation, you want to maximize the importance of understanding the importance of culture in those corporations and how culture really guides the development process and how culture binds the people in the corporations together. I think the word culture needs to be inserted in A, B, C, and D as one of the specified areas that the division of the corporation has responsibility for. So while we have identified recreation grounds, sporting and exercise facilities, and other public spaces, which yes, other public spaces could include cultural grounds. If we're going to identify recreation grounds, I think cultural grounds also should be specified, and maybe there's a definition for cultural grounds, because if you go around, particularly in the rural areas, there are cultural spaces that are so important in terms of the synergies and the glue that holds those communities together. I think the law should actually specify that. Right? Moving to 35F. And identifying part G, where I would like to suggest, so 35FG, or sorry, 35FI, where it states division of the corporation responsibility for spatial planning and building inspection shall be responsible for, and it goes down A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, and I includes conducting research in relation to factors which affect land use, and also I would add, and environmental impact. Because in these contexts moving forward, because of the new remits involved in the corporation and divisions, we should also identify this as part of their responsibility in terms of the corporation. Moving on to 35H, which is 35H Part C, which is the division of the H is the division of the corporation with responsibility for community development and social services. I would add the division with the division of the corporation with responsibility for community development and cultural and social services. I would include the word cultural next to social to identify, again, as I indicated before, the importance of culture in these communities. And Part C identifies developing and securing heritage sites within the community. I would insert, I would change that to read C, identifying, developing, maintaining, and securing heritage sites within the community. So that will become part of the mandate of the corporation, because very often, I know there's a national council that identifies and approves heritage sites in the country. But if we are thinking of what a heritage sites means in a particular community, there is no better repository of that sort of identification process than the people who live in the community, who have a special bond and a relationship with the heritage sites in those communities, as opposed to it being identified on a national scale, which it can be certainly approved in that way. But I think part of the developing and securing should be the identification and recommendation to the national body for what should be a heritage site, and if it fulfills the parameters as identified nationally, then certainly it should be identified. But I think the municipalities should be part of that process, and it's a simple insertion of a word there. Moving to, staying with 35H2, local cultural community event means an event which relates to a form of the performing arts, festivals, rituals, and customs celebrated by a group belonging to or restricted to a particular area or region of Trinidad and Tobago. And I don't understand why the word restricted was used there, because we have such commonalities. I think a more appropriate word may be specific, but it's just a choice in language. Part 35I, the division of the corporation with responsibility for infrastructure development and maintenance shall be responsible for, and we move down to Part D, maintaining government schools and government-assisted schools within the municipality. And this is a question for the Honourable Minister of Rural Development and Local Government. How does this reconcile with the work of the Education Ministry's maintenance program? And how do they delineate who's responsible for what and how that is coordinated? Because this specifically states maintaining government schools and government-assisted schools, which, by my understanding, is also presently done. So is it that it's going to be moved out of the Education Ministry's remit? Are they going to work together, or is it going to be solely the responsibility of the corporation and the division with responsibility for that? I think that needs to be clarified more succinctly. 35J, the division of the corporation with responsibility for disaster management shall be responsible for. And A, I see something that kind of raised a red flag for me. A, planning, coordination, and monitoring institution for prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and port disaster recovery, taking into account all potential disaster risks. All is a very absolute word. All don't mean 99%, all means all. And I don't know that any corporation can fulfill a mandate to take into account all potential disaster risks. Right? I also think one of the issues that needs to be specified in terms of risks, given the identification earlier on of an IT division, is the issue of cyber threats and chemical threats in particularly in municipalities that contain industrial estates and manufacturing outlets that may produce dangerous chemicals as part of what the offset is when they're producing their products and services. So I think in the present context of what we've seen with public health issues in recent times, I think, one, cyber needs to be specified so that systems are put in place to ensure that cyber protection takes place. And I know one of the questions during earlier time, the questions for oral answer, was the issue of cyber protection answered by the Honorable AG. But I think it needs to be flagged in the municipalities so that they don't only leave it up to the national systems to protect against cyber attacks. Right? In Part E, maintaining a data collection and dissemination system and regional strategic reserves of essential commodities and equipment for immediate disaster relief. And I think it should be added there in collaboration with the ODPM, which is the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management, because you don't want a situation where municipalities are working in silos when we understand how disaster mitigation takes place in Trinidad under the broad auspices of the ODPM, working with the municipalities, and you want to ensure that they understand that the data collection is also available at some level to the ODPM so that national planning can take place, and also the strategic service reserves and essential commodities and equipment for disaster release is also part of what they collaborate with the ODPM with, because at the end of the day, the ODPM as the national agency needs to be aware of what each regional municipality has in its arsenal for disaster mitigation. So I would suggest the insertion of that there. Moving on now to Mr. Vice President, 37. And a corporation shall, in relation to its municipality, be responsible for delivery of service in respect to the matters set out in the 13th schedule. And in Part 4, it states, a municipal corporation may, and I underline the word may, hold quarterly meetings with its burgesses to inform of the performance of the corporation during the quarter and to clear the concern of the burgesses. Now, that's a red herring to me, because anytime you put a municipal corporation may, they don't have to do it. I think that should be changed to shall hold annual meetings. That, to me, is ensuring there's a mechanism, a provision in the law that states that the corporation has to meet with burgesses and hear their concerns. And I'll tell you why. One of the situations that arose during the meetings with stakeholders, and we had 62 entities that are appearing before us or supplying submissions, is the phenomenon that many times, quite a number of times, when stakeholders came before the committee, they didn't even read the bill. They didn't reference what was in the bill, and I'm saying this in a productive manner. They came to vent. They came to vent about gaps, lack of services, and inadequacies, because they either could not, there was no mechanism for them to meet with the corporation and directly say, this is affecting me in the market. This is affecting me in this regard. This is affecting me in the cemetery. This is affecting me at the parks and recreation grounds. So when they came...
Senator Richards, you have 5 more minutes.
I'll ask you to pray for me too, Mr. Vice President, like the AG did. Because I have quite so much to go through. When they came to the JSC, they didn't even reference the bill. So I think it is a productive inclusion to say the municipal corporation shall hold quarterly meetings with annual meetings, with the burgesses. So that binds them by law to set out a mechanism to meet with burgesses, because they are working for the burgesses. And it shouldn't be optional that you meet with burgesses or start meeting with burgesses 6 months before a local government election comes around. Let me move quickly now. I can't go through everything I want to go through, but I wanted to deal with the issue of two issues that came up in the minority report. One, and my recommendation is that in terms of the property tax situation, which, as I said before, I think is an inevitability, there should be some sort of consideration given to eligibility for different tiers of property tax. And I'll tell you why. There are situations in this country where persons who are on pensions, and as you get older, you fall victim to more and more illnesses, and your medical bills mount, and people who are on pensions in many instances are on fixed income, and it becomes very onerous for them to even pay what may be considered small property tax. And I think some sort of eligibility criteria by application and vetting should be enacted to ensure that tiers of different property tax are available to persons who meet certain criteria and find themselves in an onerous position. The second one, and I'll rush through this, is the issue of the inequity because of the population density in many areas. And I'm suggesting that maybe consideration be given to the state identifying on a national level when they assess the possible residences, in this case property tax for residential purposes, from each corporation, find out what the national average is for the 14 corporations, and use that national average, because some will be more densely populated and collect more, and the rural areas in particular who need the resources to champion development may just not be able to come up to scratch because they can't raise the money because they're not densely populated, and find an average, a national average. And the municipalities that fall below that national average, and I know mean is one of the simplest statistical measures, the state provides a supplementation to come up to at least the national average for each of the 40 municipalities. And that will ensure at least some kind of baseline for particularly the rural communities to get some sort of supplementation so that they can fulfill their developmental programs and maintenance. Because very often, as I said before, it's interesting the Honourable Minister's title is Rural Development First and Local Government. But rural development is often sadly neglected in Trinidad and Tobago because, one, the population densities are so low that they can't raise the monies in these cases. And in this case, we don't want them falling behind because, one, they either don't have the resources to collect effectively, and we know what tax collection is like in Trinidad and Tobago sometimes, or the state can provide some sort of supplementation to reach a national benchmark to ensure rural communities have the resources that they need to fulfill their mandate, because people who live in rural communities are no less important than people who live in urban centers in Trinidad and Tobago, and they are neglected in so many ways. And I think the state, they deserve the support of the state in particular when we're making law like this. The other final point I want to make, and I think I probably have 30 more seconds, is I support Senator Mark's assertion that local government should find its way reposed somewhere in our Constitution. Because as it stands, if we feel, or if someone who is reposed with the power to call local government doesn't feel to call it, they don't have to call it. We've seen it go on and on in Trinidad and Tobago for many years, and I think it needs to find, as we seek to make it more, formalize it more in this particular report and bill and law, we need to show its importance by reposing it firmly in the Constitution. And with those few words and my overtime, Mr. Vice President, I thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senate is suspended for 30 minutes.